Hi, this is Lindsay Newitter of the Posture Police, and today I'm interviewing Heather Radke. And Heather is a writer living in New York. She's writing a book on the cultural history of the female butt. Now, you might be wondering why somebody who teaches people about their posture would be interested in this topic. And I am highly interested in this topic because I have found through my work that the way that people hold themselves, the way that they move, the way that they live in their bodies has a lot to do with how they perceive themselves. And sometimes even how they perceive the size or the shape or the location of their body parts, which may not always be accurate. So I have Heather here. Hello, Heather.
Hi, Lindsay. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I want to just start by hearing a little bit about you and how you ended up writing about this topic.
Okay, great. So I've been living in New York for about 4.5 years, and I moved here to get my MFA in nonfiction at Columbia. And before I moved here, I was living in Chicago for about 10 years, working as a radio producer and as a museum curator. And the way I got interested in this project was, I think maybe it won't surprise people to know about because of my own body and my own relationship with my body. So I am a white lady with a pretty big butt, and my mother also has a pretty big butt, and all her sisters do too. She's one of 5, or at least that's what they would say. And I grew up with in the 90s at a time when, and in a pretty white suburb of Lansing, Michigan, at a time when having the body I had felt almost freakish, which is sort of funny to think about now, because I think, like so many of us, when I look at pictures of myself as a teenager, I just look sort of normal. But I got teased a little bit about it when I was a kid, and then in my 20s, I started to have this other reaction to having a big butt from men in particular. But what I started to really notice was how, at least for me, being the demographic I am, the way people reacted to this part of my body had really changed. And so it went from being something that was sort of hated to something that was sort of loved. And I became really interested in that question, like how can a part of the body go in and out of fashion? And also, how do we understand our bodies and how do they make us feel about ourselves? And then when I started to really look into it, I started to see how history and the histories of race and gender and class really play into how we perceive our bodies. And so this is sort of like a fun way to talk about what I see are pretty serious subjects.
Yeah, it's really interesting how many different subjects and issues that you can hit on just from that one topic that was personal to you. And from where I'm coming from, I'm looking at how people move, how people hold themselves, and these types of patterns, they can start pretty early. They can start during childhood. They can start often during the teenage years, where people will start to react to their bodies changing, react to how people are responding to them. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple of things. First of all, I think from myself, I think my own idea about my body definitely formed when I was a teenager. And I'm also doing a bunch of interviews for this project. So, it's not a scholarly project, but I'm interviewing lots of scientists and historians and all kinds of, fashion historians, et cetera. But I'm also doing a series of interviews with a diverse set of women, different races, ages, about how they feel about their bodies and their butts. And the thing that comes up so often is how an idea of the body and the self kind of forms in the teenage years, and then it's so difficult to kind of upend or change that idea of the self. So to some extent, what your peers are saying about you when you're 12 and 13, and sort of what you're thinking about yourself at that age becomes pretty ossified in my, at least, according to the women that I'm interviewing. And I think for me, the thing that's interesting, like when I think back on those years, it's not like I was horribly bullied or something, but just how this part of my body, my butt, is like, it's actually quite hard to cover. It's really hard to hide. And, you hold your body in certain ways that kind of, you find yourself kind of wishing you could disappear in a sense, I think. And I think that's a pretty common experience for teenage girls. So I can imagine it actually has quite an effect on the way people embody themselves, if that makes any sense.
Right. I think that people will often try to, hide whatever they're getting the feedback about that they don't necessarily want, or they're just feeling self-conscious about. And sometimes they're not even necessarily aware of it. I think that a lot of women are aware of maybe having pulled their shoulders forward because they were starting to get breasts. But what I think is interesting about the butt is that it's behind us, right? So we might be less aware of what we do with our bodies to sort of, control how people see it. And the thing is, you can't really hide it, but
Exactly.
you could sort of, tuck it, which means tipping your pelvis in a particular way. You could just keep your hips from moving when you walk, and end up being kind of rigid. Are these things that you've ever noticed in yourself or in any of the people you interviewed?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting thing, the thing about the hips, because something that comes up in a lot of these interviews is, the butt, like the breasts, it's a sexual, it's a sexualized part of the body. And so I think one of the things that's happening for a lot of women when they're becoming women, like as they are, during puberty, is that there's a lot of complicated feelings about becoming a sexualized body, so, and the fact that you first start to feel yourself both internally as a person with sexual desires, but also like you feel the objectification that's just part of what it is to be a woman in the world. And so, one woman I talked to me a lot about how she was really aware of men looking at her, and one of the ways to sort of, that she tried to control that was to kind of stop the sway of her hips. So, but then it's also interesting because I just interviewed a couple of men who one of them also does drag, and they make these hip and butt pads for mostly for the drag queens in the trans community. And one of the things that they talked about was having to kind of learn that sway and teach it to people. And so I think that kind of like the ways that we move our bodies and how those movements are gendered and sexualized, I think it probably has like a pretty big effect on how people actually just are in their bodies.
Absolutely. And sometimes I do notice pretty consistent differences between genders, and just habits that tend to come up more often in men or more often in women in terms of how they walk. I've even had people say, after I've sort of got them freeing up their movement a little bit, they might say, something like, this doesn't feel like how I should culturally be moving.
That's
But what's what there are a couple of problems with, I think, how we can sort of, be hiding ourselves or, holding parts of our body, is that it could potentially lead to injury. And I think it also really prevents us from putting our whole selves out there when, we are trying to connect with people, trying to communicate. It's a way of sort of, keeping yourself smaller.
Yeah, and I think it makes people, I mean, I sort of think it depends on what we're talking about, but I think the feeling of wanting to be smaller is a feeling that, makes a lot of people really sad. I mean, one person talked to me about, it's not quite the same thing, but about wearing, 3 pairs of Spanx to make sure that her to make her butt smaller, and like how that made, you know, it like physically changed her digestive system, and you know, made her uncomfortable every minute of her life. And you know, the kind of self-consciousness about the body, I mean, it's sad, and I think it's sort of particular. I mean, I think men feel it too in a way, but I think that there's a very particular way that women experience it. And another thing I think that comes up a lot in these interviews is the way that women, just, you know, they're, when they go to buy clothes or when they look at themselves in the mirror, how they just have like a very off perception of their bodies, you know. And they like it, you know, I do some of these interviews in person, and the person will tell me, oh, you know, like I definitely can't wear this kind of clothing or that kind of clothing, because I have this type of body or that type of body. And then, you know, they'll be standing right in front of me, and I'll just sort of be like, you know, just for what it's worth, that's not my perception of what your body looks like. And it's as though, you know, we're just like speaking different languages, or, you know, it's just very hard to see yourself for what you actually are.
Well, I think when I first met you, was something that came to mind was just how, as I became more aware of my body and just really sensing being in my body, I started to actually shop differently. And I realized that I had been shopping based on thinking that what I saw on a mannequin would be the clothes that would look good on me, and that's how they would look on me. But that I really didn't have a very clear perception of my own shape and what might be flattering. And so I think that, you know, as we change our perceptions, it can change our bodies. And then as we change our bodies, it can change our perceptions.
Right. Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think also that there's like a real liberation in seeing yourself the way you actually are, instead of the way you imagine yourself to be. Because I think we both imagine ourselves much, you know, more in an idealized way and much less in an idealized way. And that there's, you know, there's a lot to be said for sort of like seeking reality in some sense, you know. I mean, I think probably from your position, I'd be curious to know, I feel like having a reality based idea of what your body, where your body is in space and how your body looks, probably actually helps to move it in a way that's like a little bit more functional. And I think that's probably also true in, you know, and just like feeling good about yourself, because it allows yourself to, you know, at least for me, it's certainly not, I mean, like, it's not like doing this work is actually like made it so I'm like 100% comfortable with my body, but I think it's made me think a lot about like, well, why is it bad to be big in places? Why is it that I want to wear these clothes that look this way, you know? And to actually just like allow myself to question those things has been pretty profound.
Yeah, that's great. And I think as we question those things, I think we give ourselves the permission to take up our space. And I think it helps us breathe better. It helps us, you know, it might help with your digestion if you're not trying to squeeze your space.
If you stop wearing all those Spanx, it helps a lot.
I think people don't realize that the things that they're doing to try to kind of from the outside in change how they look can actually be harming their health. And you know, when we want to come across well, it also, we're inviting people in more, I think, when we're really accepting ourselves and taking up our own space as opposed to trying to manipulate it.
Yeah, and I think it's such a nice way to talk about it, because we sometimes use this phrase, take up space, like I don't want to take up too much space, or I want to take up space. But you know, even as a writer, it's a thing I've thought about, is like, how much space on a page can I take up? How much, you know, like, am I allowed to just like write about whatever I want? And I think the fact is that that phrase comes from a kind of, it's both, I feel like it's both related to and comes out of a way we think about our bodies. Like, how much space am I allowed to literally take up in the world?
Right.
And I think really letting yourself think about that, like, how much space am I allowing myself to take up in the world? And why does smallness have so much currency for women?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I actually what I wrote about on my blog this week was actually about that phrase, "take up your
Oh,
space,"
great.
because I think that people they sometimes they try to do it, but they're not even really consciously aware of where their space is
Mm.
because they spent so much time not taking it up.
Yeah, that's
So,
fascinating. I mean, I think it's such interesting work you do to help women, enact the space taking up, and men too. I mean, I think it's, I think that there's a way, like, of course, this is all true for women, but I also think obviously all these, these gendered issues have an effect on all people of all genders.
yeah, I absolutely agree. Um, so I just want to wrap up with just bringing up that you're still interviewing people for your book, and you're still looking for people to volunteer to be interviewed?
Yeah, so the way I do these interviews is they take, I don't know, about 40, 45 minutes, and um, they're almost like oral histories where I ask a similar set of questions to everyone, and we sort of have a conversation about uh, the person I'm interviewing's body and how they feel about their body and how they feel about their butt and where those feelings come from. Um, and I'd love to interview anybody who's interested. I'm trying to get uh, as diverse of an array of people as possible. And the interviews, I'm not quite sure how they'll end up in the book, but because I'm thinking of them more as oral histories than as like journalism interviews, I'm definitely gonna be in a lot of conversation with the people who I'm interviewing about how it will be in the book. Like, I'm not going to just take your interview and stick it in there without your permission.
Of
So,
course.
because it's obviously a really sensitive and kind of hyper personal thing to talk about. So, anybody who's interested, I also think, for what it's worth, I think it can be a lot of fun. And
I'm going to do it.
yes, and Lindsay's going to do it imminently. So, yeah. So, anybody who's interested, I'd love to interview you, and you can get in touch with me. Um, and I think Lindsay will give you my email
Yes,
address.
I'll,
And
I'll provide I'll provide your email address. It'll be below this interview, and you can contact Heather directly. And I just wanted to mention that one of the reasons why I am talking about this topic is in relation to my course, which is called Posture Under Pressure: Command Your Presence for Effective Communication. And it is a course specifically for women on how to really inhabit your body, take up your space in a very conscious way where you're able to really use all of your resources available to you when you are communicating. And that could be communicating to many people. It could be in a meeting, it could be a one-on-one conversation, it could be in your family or with your children. So the topic is communication, and the next workshop is going to be on Sunday, October 6th. There is more information on that below as well. So thank you, Heather. This has been really fascinating, and I'm really glad we got to talk and share this with everybody.
yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, take care. Thank you.
Okay.